I'm going to trim it on YouTube after the fact. Okay, I think it says we're on now. Okay. Just going to do the preview on YouTube to make sure that we're hooked up and ready to go. Hey, sweet. Okay, enhancements, live events. There's a control room on YouTube where I can do controlling. Alright, the health is good. Broadcast alert. Okay. Public view. Okay, it's analytics. There's one current viewer, and that's me. Okay.
What's the Twitter handle for that you're going to do this out of?
Oh, just my own personal one, Jeffrey Palermo. Yeah, it's don't have an AzureAustin Twitter yet. View on watch page. Okay. You ready to rock, Paul?
Yep.
Alright, so... And James, you and I need to keep our microphone on mute so that Paul's video stays in the forefront. Okay? Alright, perfect. Alright, here we go. Just pause a second. I'll wave my hand. Am I cutting out?
Your video's dropping.
Okay. We'll wait until it gets better. Alright, we'll just start. Welcome to Azure Austin. This is the February virtual meeting of Azure Austin, a educational user group focused around Windows Azure and all things Microsoft Cloud. We are here with Paul Drew, the president of DevOps Unlimited, and he's going to give us some tips on managing Azure from a DevOps perspective. And also in the panel audience is James Shaw, senior architect at ClearMeasure. And so, Paul, let me kick it over to you. Take it away. Thanks for sharing with us.
Cool, no problem. Thanks, Jeffrey. So one of the things that often comes up is how do you handle compliance in the cloud? Now, some of the people I've talked with have a very firm opinion that you cannot do compliance in the cloud, and then there are others that believe there's no issues at all. And so I believe that it's up to you and your company, depending on your own needs, whether or not the cloud suits you and which cloud will suit best for you. But if you're looking at Azure as a vehicle for your application, there are a number of things that you could do from a DevOps perspective to not only make it functional in the way that you need, but maybe make some security auditors and some compliance people happier along the way. One of the things is when you provision VMs in Azure, each one's an island, and it becomes very challenging to make them talk without opening up endpoints over the internet. And nobody wants to open up all those extra endpoints because it makes the auditors unhappy and introduces risks that you may not want to into your environment. So what I did was I set about for one of our customers to figure out how can we get a standard three-tiered architecture with the same security that we want or espouse to have, so that we can have the internal communication within the applications without exposing everything on the internet. So the first thing you have to do is think about performance. And performance you can do by having the affinity groups. So the affinity groups, when you create your VMs and your virtual data center in Azure, that basically says we want these machines to be on as close of hardware and memory and CPU as possible, so that you lower the latency and the amount of hops that you have to take between your VMs, so that you maximize the performance. That's, as a base level, everyone should set up infinity groups. Secondly is location. Now, unless you're architecting and engineering your application in a way that you're going to need some things on the East Coast and things on the West Coast, most people are starting off with maybe a couple of small websites, and maybe you only need a handful of VMs. So the best thing to do is to create them in the same location. Now, if you mess up and you didn't think about that ahead of time, if you're just starting off, it's probably easier just to delete your VM and go back and recreate it if you haven't done much. Now, if you have started down the road, let's say you're a few days or weeks into the configuration, or maybe you've had it up for a while, but you realize that you really should have them in the same location because of performance or various other reasons, there are some Azure PowerShell commandlets that you can use to not only move it between one zone and the other, the VHZ files, but if you mistyped or made a mistake, let's say you just want to rename your VM, you can use those same commandlets to rename it. So some of that does take some work, and obviously have to have a knowledge of PowerShell, but it is possible to do. The third thing to think about, and this is where most of the network geeks kind of get upset or really are interested, is how do you handle the network? So I mentioned before, you need to typically have a three-tiered architecture. So you need your web VLAN that's exposed to the internet. You typically have an app VLAN that's kind of tucked away behind it. And then you'll have a database VLAN, which is your precious data that you don't want anywhere close to the internet. So how do you handle that? Well, there are networks, and then there's virtual networks, and this is all very confusing. And I'll tell you, I've scratched my head for a long time before I finally figured out how to actually implement it. So I'm going to tell you how to do it, and I'm going to tell you how to go back and do it if you did it wrong in the first place, and you maybe need to make some changes. So first, you create your network. So call it Contoso Network, Contoso Corporate, or just Contoso, or whatever your company name is. But you create a network, right? Then what you want to do is create a virtual network. A virtual network is typically used to bridge back, like through an IPsec tunnel or VPN tunnel, into your corporate infrastructure. And so it's inside that virtual network that you can define those different subnets, so your web, your application, and your database. And so you do those as if you're going to hook it up to an IPsec tunnel into your corporate network. Now the beauty is that when you're creating your VMs, now we haven't created any VMs at this point, but if you have, I'll show you how to go back in a second and do that. But let's say you've now got your corporate network, and then you have your corporate virtual network, and let's say you have a web, app, and database VLANs inside of there, or subnets that you do right through the Azure interface. And maybe I can put some screenshots together later that have been sanitized from data perspective, showing you how it's done. But you create those subnets. Then when you create your VMs, you select the network, and then you select the virtual network that it goes into it, and then it'll pull up dynamically a selector box that allows you to choose which of those subnets to go into, web, application, or database. So you go through and you create all your VMs and you put them in the appropriate VLAN. So you'll find that if all the application servers all have the same subnet, and they can actually talk to each other directly without a firewall in between, which is exactly the behavior that you want. Secondly, or I should say not a hardware or Azure firewall, there'll still be the Windows firewall. So if you notice that you won't be able to talk in between VLANs correctly still, so those are isolated just like you would want from a compliance and security standpoint. Now, I mentioned before, what happens if you already had your VMs created and you need to move them into the VM, into those networks? Well, you could delete them if you just created them. It may be quicker, But there's another way to work around it. So I know this is scary, but you can actually go in and delete the VM. And when it says, do you want to keep the attached hard drives? You want to say yes. You don't want to delete those. So they will stay in your storage account. Now you may have to wait 5 to 10 minutes for that to complete and for replication and the databases to get updated. But what will happen is you can go back in and say, I want to create a new VM. And this time, instead of saying from template or quick create, you say from gallery. And you go on the bottom left of that menu and it'll say my disks. And you'll see underneath there in the disk menu, you'll see that VM disk that you created. You click it, click next, it'll ask you to name it, give it the same name, or if you wanted to rename it here, you could. And then now you select the right network and virtual network subnet that you wanted in. And then it'll take a couple minutes to provision, and it's back up again, which is pretty handy if you've made some mistakes in the beginning or want to reconfigure things. Now, once you have those all up in place, you still need to open up the endpoints for those VLANs to connect to each other, but you can do it on a much more granular scale versus opening it up to the world. Additionally, if you wanted to deploy something like in-service bus or any other protocol-specific implementation to where you need to have more control over the environment. So I'll use in-service bus as an example because you have to have NetBIOS resolution, which is name without DNS, and you have to have ICMP replies on, so things like ping and finger so that it can have a heartbeat between all the different services. So unfortunately, the only way to do the NetBIOS resolution is by doing host files. So you'll have to open up your C:\Windows System32 drivers, etc, host file with Notepad, punch in the IP of the machine you want to talk to, including the local server's IP, and these are all the internal IPs I'm talking about. You know, tab and then the NetBIOS name of your machine. Then you save it out. Now you may have to add permissions to that file to edit it under security settings to be able to save it. Otherwise, it'll keep prompting you to add .txt on there. But then you do that. Your host file is updated. Then you should be able to open a command prompt as administrator. You know, Windows R or just Windows CMD. Right click, run as administrator. Then you can ping and ping your local name, and then ping your remote name, and you should be able to get that internal IP to reply. If you've opened the Windows firewall, and that's the part that gets most people confused, is the Windows firewall is not the easiest thing to work with, but under some hidden settings that you kind of have to drill into, you can open up ICMP replies. And so ICMP is Internet Control Message Protocol. I mentioned it before. It's so ping, and it's kind of a low-level protocol for how things know about other things and communicate. So when you're going into the Windows firewall, instead of saying a program or a port, you say custom. And under the custom, you go under there and there's a pull down. Well, you'll say anything to any port, and then there's a pull down. You can choose ICMP. You want to choose both IPv4 and go. That's the first one. You'll go through. You'll make sure that the next checkbox is allow, and then you'll save it. I'll just call it ICMP v4. Click save. Go through the same thing again, but do ICMP version 6 for IPv6. Save it, call it IPv6, and you have to do this process both on the incoming connections and the outgoing connections. And so it's a lot of little rules, but once you do it, it's really not that hard to set up for the first time. But once you do that, then things like ping and all that will work, and it'll allow you to implement something like in-service bus and have a really scalable application that otherwise may seem a bit daunting to try and implement because there's so many little hurdles that most developers aren't familiar with having to circumvent at a machine level. The only other tip that I have today, Jeffrey, for the team and everybody, is that most people have gotten a little bit reticent about worrying about antivirus. And Windows Defender, for example, is built into Windows 8, and you can use Windows Essentials for Windows 7, and it's free out there. But if you try to download it and install it for a server, it won't work. It'll tell you need to go get a licensed product for it. But actually, if you download it, go in a command line to that installer, msi.exe, and do /no OS limits. It'll install on the server, update, scan, and operate just perfectly fine. I'm not sure how that is affected by the EULA, but I know that it works, and it gives you a little bit more peace of mind if you don't have the ability to spring for something like a McAfee, Symantec, Trend Micro, or the official Microsoft Forefront products. So I think that's all I got right now, but I'm open to questions if you have anything specific.
Well, from someone who's been running um, complex data center configurations, and I think previously in your career you ran some pretty significant systems. What's the main difference from your perspective managing it on premise or in a data center, colo, versus in Windows Azure?
That's a good question, Jeffrey. There's some benefits to a lot of things are automated. It's a lot easier to manage a firewall. So when your basic settings, ability to provision a VM quickly, install software, open up ports, take snapshots, you could do a lot more today that you previously needed a larger staff to do. So the trick, I think, is when you need to get more advanced. So some cloud providers are more like a utility where you may not be able to get other than exactly what's in the interface. And so some advanced configurations may be more challenging and frankly impossible to pull off. But if you design with those architectures or limitations known, you can do really well with it. I think the opportunities that the geographic redundancy and high availability provide with the cloud are awesome, and I think they're going to change how we develop applications and think about things as far as scalability, and even back to what type of an IT team do you even need to have in place. Maybe it affords you the ability to have more developers, which should make a better impact to your business versus network engineers and people that are a bit of a more expensive to have when you may not even have a full need for them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, speaking of software engineers, I remember I think it was March or April of 2013 when Azure made some huge strides in the IaaS section, and we started adopting it at a much higher rate. One thing I found is because it is so easy for software engineers to provision something or change something or get in from the control panel. We sort of relearned a age-old lesson that if an environment has an audience that is not just a development environment, but if it has an audience outside of the software engineering team, then it really doesn't belong to the software engineering team, and none of those guys should really go in and change anything or push any buttons. And it's probably good for them to not really have the access to do so, just because maybe it's easy, technologically speaking, to provide that access. I think some of the old principles of separation of control will still exist here.
Absolutely, it's a good point, Jeffrey, and I think it's one that gets overlooked a lot. So, one is it's been around forever, but now that it's not just as easy to throw pizza boxes out there, you can have server sprawl really quickly. So you got a lot of services racking up a lot of dollars really quickly, even though it's cheap. When you got a lot of stuff out there and anyone can turn it on, you lose control of that, and the cost center starts to really get out of control. So you want to make sure you're getting paid or have a way to budget for that, and so the separation of controls affords you that. So even if it's a small internal process of an email approval, you need to have some kind of safeguard on that, or you could find yourself trying to figure out how to pay for a very large bill. The second part is, you can, the same benefits that I was talking about a minute ago with the ability to go into self-service to open up ports and to do different things can leave you wide open because you may have not thought about that you wanted to get access to your Microsoft SQL or MySQL environment from your local dev box, that you opened up the endpoint, but you did it on the known port and somebody got in and you didn't think about that. You got root with no password as a default in most MySQL installations. So I think that from a security perspective, it's very scary for a lot of people, and that's how things happen. And I can't tell you the number of times in my career where somebody's configured something that was internet facing with the test username, with the test password, and it gets in. And something as simple as SFTP could be compromised from that perspective. Once you're in, you just don't want to open that can of worms. And additionally, having the ability for someone to go delete someone else's servers could cost you thousands of dollars, if not lose your intellectual property that may have been not backed up. Because, again, we take for granted the geographic redundancy. We take for granted that the cloud will always be around. You weren't backing it up. What happens then? And that becomes a big problem too. So I think GitHub and Bitbucket and some of those systems are helping that a little bit, forming a code escrow, if you will, to help mitigate that. But I think even those have their same drawbacks too.
Yeah, I was reading the other day where IT managers were complaining that up to 90% of the resources were suddenly kind of going out from underneath their control and were being managed by architects and developers suddenly, because of Azure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit scary for some traditional IT people. On one hand, you get to play with some really cool, new, sophisticated, mature toys that empower your business, and at the same time, removing the need for you and these skills that you've developed. So there's less of a need for you, and so it is interesting to see the shift that's happening within IT of the pros and cons of it, what the cloud brings to you.
Yeah, what I'm using it for is obviously for running up test environments. So they're very temporary environments, and they're brought up and thrown away on a daily basis. But it's perfect for that situation where I can control, using my PowerShell scripts, creating a large number of test environments that have got automatically installed Windows services and all sorts of unit test frameworks, which automatically run, and then I can download the results automatically, and then just throw the whole thing away, throw all the VMs away, and start afresh the next day. So Azure for me is certainly a godsend as far as automated testing. I've done it all in PowerShell, so it's just literally almost a push of a button. I just type in the name of the VM network that I want, and it the networks that I'm creating are quite complex, so it creates it uses the same affinity group, but it creates 3 separate services and VMs. It puts them in a network. It opens up file shares between the 3 VMs, installs Windows services, which then have to be the servers have to be rebooted for, sets a whole bunch of Windows environment variables and registry keys. And when it reboots, then the unit tests get installed, they run, and the results get sent back. And it's all just from typing in a few characters on the keyboard. So PowerShell and Azure to me has changed the way automated testing can work, for sure.
Yeah, and that's pretty interesting, because I would say 5 years ago, what you're doing, if I understand correctly, wouldn't have been financially feasible. It would have taken a team of engineers, a whole lot of capital, months to set up these configurations, and it's going to be done by humans, and there's going to be configuration issues and errors, and it wouldn't be financially even practical for a company to do such types of rigorous testing across different product suites and such.
Yeah, I've never done test, personally. I've managed test engineers, but this is the first time I've been acting as a test engineer on a project. And luckily we had these tools available for us. We already had an Azure account set up, so I can create a few dozen VMs just with a click of a button, and throw them away the next day and start again, and keep tweaking the script to get better and better over time. I'm always adding little tweaks here. I mean, I get really annoyed by those pop-up admin screens that you see on every time you open a server, so I just went in and found the reg key for that, stuck them in the script, and now I don't have to check that box and make the windows go away anymore,
Yeah.
UAC's turned off, and file name extensions are turned on, and all of these sorts of things. Everything is scriptable, so every time I find something that's getting in my way, I get rid of it, update the scripts, and the next VMs that I spawn the next day don't have that problem. So it's
James,
very satisfying.
you're doing a lot of heavy hitting stuff across multiple servers, file shares and whatnot, that you wouldn't want going over the internet. And it was middle of last year when Azure introduced the software VPN, and that was a big change, because opening, and Paul, you mentioned opening a port to MySQL or anything over the internet needs to be an intentional decision. And what's your thoughts on running everything completely closed off behind a software VPN and just not exposing anything to the outside world?
Is that a question for me or James?
Uh, Either one, but Paul, I'd like to see what you think about that.
I think it's great, depending on the business application of it. I mean, from the virtual networks that we talked about earlier, the fact that you could theoretically hook up into your VM space and not expose any of it to the internet. It would all go through the tunnel, and they would never be actually exposed out through a public IP address. And it would afford you a lot of scale elasticity, so you can go up and down as you need based on your business needs. Maybe you have some math applications that fire up during the day. Some of the same tools that James is developing could be applied for those same sort of solutions. And internally, your team is supporting it based on how many people are crunching these numbers or doing whatever it is during their workday, and then at night it starts to scale back down depending on the individual workers. And I think we're seeing some of that with the VHDs, or the not VHDs, the VDI, the virtual desktop images, where people get either thin clients, or they bring their own device, or maybe they're working from home. They log into the corporate VPN, and then they get their virtual desktop that already has all their tools and everything provisioned for them.
Yeah. So I'm just reading what Jeffrey's written. Yeah, one of the things that I've discovered is that adding all of these new bits and pieces to the scripts, and because I'm throwing the VMs away, I'm not worried about security right now. I'm just doing these things, throwing them away. So I'm opening file shares and not using VPNs that you're talking about. But, I have to be less worried about the security from my perspective, because the VMs are very temporary, have no access to anything else, and disappear within hours. I had one interesting development that I had to put in the script last week, which was adding latency simulators. So I used this free app called TM-NetSim, which I added to my script and installed that on the Azure VMs, and now I can again automatically specify what the latency for the network's going to be, and I can put in 100 milliseconds plus or minus 20, or 250 plus or minus 50, or whatever, and just keep modifying the latency when I create these VM networks. And I'm testing a network product, so that makes a huge difference to the unit tests. Just every time we have one of these ideas, you just add it into the script and keep improving it. I don't know if you've used any latency simulators, especially with Azure.
I have not. No, it's very interesting. How are you guys doing your installation? You mentioned PowerShell. Are you doing all of your provisioning within PowerShell scripts? Or are you using something like BoxStarter or Chocolatey or anything like that?
No, everything's PowerShell. I created a couple of PowerShell modules which have basically some generic Azure functionality methods, and then I've created a customer-specific module as well, which has all of the unit test-specific code for their application. So when we move on to other customers that are running on Azure, I've got one library that I can reuse, and one that is customer-specific, and obviously I can take code from that as I need it. But everything's in PowerShell and very self-contained. The unit tests, I did write a C# executable, so I can do some very specific performance testing. but everything else, all of the deployment, all of the installation and configuration is all handled in PowerShell.
I find it fascinating that all this PowerShell stuff to set up Windows, it's not even Azure at all. It's not anything that's built into Windows Azure. It's just regular stuff that can run on Windows. And because Windows VMs are Windows, then all of the provisioning of turning on Windows features, of changing settings, and all this stuff is built right into PowerShell, as opposed to being something new that was added to Azure. And because Azure's built on everything Windows, everything we're used to doing with Windows and the new stuff that 2008 R2 and 2012 came out with, it's just automatically there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, obviously you have to install the Azure PowerShell extensions to get the access to the Azure-specific methods, like create VM, create service, all of those sorts of things. But other than that, yeah, it's like you say, it's just PowerShell.
Yeah, I remember provisioning and spinning up a server with the web deploy toolkit and ASP.NET with IIS, and there's just so many boxes to check that for a while I've had this script in my back pocket that if I want to install an ASP.NET website on a server and use web deploy tool, then there's this whole list of stuff that has to be done to prep that server. And with a PowerShell script, all the steps can be baked in. Just let it go and walk away and come back, and it'll be finished. So all the automation is just a real time saver.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. I mean, there's a lot of different uses for Azure, of course, but for the test automator, I mean, it's a godsend. Like I said, you can do so much with it. I couldn't do this on regular servers, in half the time or money, a tenth of the time.
Yeah, easily. What do you guys think from a future set? What's the number one thing that you can think of right now that isn't in Azure today that you would like?
Snapshots. The ability to snapshot a VM like you can any other platform is the number one thing I think all developers would want.
I thought you could snapshot a VM.
No, you can't. You can kind of fake your way around snapshotting VHDs and things like that, but it's not quite the same functionality as a one-click snapshot copy and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I gotcha. Jeffrey, do you have anything you'd like?
Well, there's one, and this isn't anything technical, but it's just something that's hit me several times, is the account management functionality. And I think in last month's meeting we touched on it a little bit, where the account that you use to create the Azure subscription owns it, and you can designate someone else to be the service administrator, but oftentimes in your organization you want someone to be the billing contact, or someone to be able to pull usage reports, or at least pull the invoice and be able to pay the invoice. And oftentimes that person isn't a technical person at all, and there is nowhere in the Azure subscription to be able to give your accountant or bookkeeper ability to do that. And so you have to put in a service ticket to put in this list behind the scenes that they call account delegates, and there's no UI for it whatsoever, but you put in a support ticket with them, and they'll add an account delegate so that your bookkeeping department can actually pull an invoice. So it'd be nice to expose that on the front end, to be a time saver with the number of Azure subscriptions that we create. And so it's just an ongoing thing that every time we create one for a software engineering project, we have to go through that step all over again.
Yeah, I think for me, I need to go check this again. It's been a couple months since I looked, but trying to use the CDN, the media services, was a bit daunting. That we couldn't just upload files, some static images that we'd want to be cached out there. We had to upload them as blobs, and then we had to write an interface to be able to upload them into the CDN, which it was a huge turnoff, and wasn't very helpful at all.
Yeah, I have a long list of bugs and things that are a little flaky, but you kind of work around them and either use a different method or try things in a loop or whatever. But, there's certainly some instances where, like with add Azure account and set Azure subscription, they work, and then 5 minutes later you have to do them again because they've lost somehow the license.
I really love I really love the integration with Windows Azure, Visual Studio 2013, and the new Visual Studio Online, which for a while was called Team Foundation Service. I think I just noticed a month or so ago there's a node for Visual Studio Online in the Azure subscription. So, so obviously you can use Azure for any kind of environment, but for software engineering teams using it for dev and test and assigning the Azure subscription to the team, it works really well because we use Visual Studio Online integrated with an Azure subscription for the dev and test servers, continuous integration, and the Git source code repository along with some task tracking. So just the integration that they've done with the development-focused cloud services, and then the integration with both Visual Studio Online and Windows Azure subscriptions in Visual Studio 2013, it's just nice that they pulled it all together and made the dev tools really easy to use.
Yeah, they've done a great job from a developer perspective of making it accessible and usable, and that is expected given that it is Microsoft and that they're in the business of creating development tools. I think that they're going to continue to lag behind until they can make it enterprise friendly, so that the enterprise IT admin can get in and do stuff without having to write code, and that's a big problem that we have right now. I would say for my usability. James, I think you hit on it a while ago when we talked about taking snapshots. One of the things I do love about technology is there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? And so, there's ways to find solutions to solve the problems, maybe in different ways you didn't think of, but it is flexible, and it is kind of fun thinking outside the box sometimes when you find out how to do it. You're like, yeah, that's kind of cool. I never thought about that, or you have to Google around and find somebody else's solution. It's definitely an opportunity for growth, at least for me with an IT background.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I first started on this job, if there were snapshots, I would have set up a server, taken a snapshot, and then I would have just kept spawning that up for my environments, right? So I would have approached it a completely different way, but because they didn't exist,
exactly,
I had to create a VM and then set it up the way I wanted every time, and that kind of seems wasteful in some ways, but that's just the way it had to be done. So. Well, not actually. I could have created a VHD and uploaded it, but again, that whole process is just as long-winded anyway.
I'm wondering if it's has it forced you to move to a code-centric provisioning process rather than starting with a library of snapshots or a library of hard drives?
Well, that may be the programmer in me coming out, of course. I'm tempted to go that way because it gives me more control rather than relying on a library of predefined setups. I can change it on a as needed basis. I've got parameters that I can just specify when I create these VMs, and I can choose the instance size, or I can choose which MSI I'm going to upload, how many files I'm going to automatically create in the test suite, things like this. They're all in parameters, so although they have defaults, I can specify them each time. So it does give me a lot more flexibility, the route I took. It just took some more time to get it up, installed initially.
Yeah, see, it's the initial setup, right? That you have to invest the time to kind of build that groundwork. I'll tell you, in the past, I had my own private cloud, and we had our templates, they were hardened and all that, and we'd roll them out. We had our list of activities that we would undertake with each. And now it's no longer a list of activities. It's a script that, similar to yours, but it's more infrastructure specific. But I don't have the luxury nowadays of mandating all Azure or my private cloud or even Savvis or AT&T or Rackspace. There's so many cloud providers, and so I have to have a solution that doesn't rely on a templates being in a central location. I have to be able to build something that will allow me to have a consistent application infrastructure, that meets all the needs of my clients, regardless of what cloud it's in.
Now, this might be a bit off topic, but how does your script cope with different cloud providers? I mean, is there how much consistency amongst the scripts is there?
Well, the scripts all start with, most of them are specific to PowerShell and Chocolatey to grab the stuff that I need, and they're run within VMs that are set up, because I obviously can't have consistent commands to create the VMs, because everyone does their APIs a little bit different. Some people are Zen, Citrix focused, some are VMware shop, some are OpenStack, and so I can't do it that way. So, I'll use the portals to provision the VMs, because not all of them are huge. It's great to have a problem where you have hundreds or thousands of servers, but most of the clients, they got a handful of servers. They got a couple web, couple app, maybe 1 or 2 DBs. And so you go into their portal, you provision those, and then you pop into each VM, and then you run your script. That's hardening stuff, turning off IS, lower cipher levels, doing all my rigmarole that I used to do as a set of activities. Now I just script it, and so it ended up being a huge time saver.
Well, we're getting to the end of our time. Anything else to share with the audience?
Not at this time. Thanks for having me. It was a really good conversation, and I welcome anybody that might be watching this. If you've got any tips or tricks on workarounds for things like snapshotting or how to do more advanced stuff, maybe with NetBIOS or anything like that, that'd be great to hear.
All right, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, James, for joining us as a audience panelist. And for the viewers out there, Azure Austin is the 3rd Monday of every month, and you're watching this on the Azure Austin YouTube channel, so stay tuned here to see all the information. And we also have a website on meetup.com/AzureAustin, and you can contact us on either one of those venues, and we'd love to have you join the meetup group. So until next time, thank you very much. Have a great day.